I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, the Wurundjeri people of the Greater Kulin Nation here in Victoria. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And everyone for coming to this session. Some of you would have come to Sapna's first report launch last week, which broadly and essentially spoke to the need for diversity in the climate movement, and did that through the perspective of interviews and research and writing I did in the report based on interviews with 12 South Asian youth activists. And thank you for that splendid session. And some of you would have come to workshops in August and September on why North-South intersectionality matters in climate activism, which I ran from the Sapna platform. We've had some really good conversations in these two sessions, extended sessions, and today is kind of a culmination of those conversations in a way that we're interested as a co-founder of Sapna South Asian Climate Solidarity and as an activist and now a researcher who's worked across India and Australia for over the last 20 years, interested to bring this conversation to a bigger kind of climate movement forum. And this beginning of COP, in fact, before COP begins is a really good time to bring that conversation in. And before I begin my presentation, I will introduce very quickly the three respondent panelists who are joining me today. And I'm really thankful for your time. We have Aimee Mehan, who's a First Nations Gomeroi woman from region New South Wales. Aimee came to the workshops and we had some really critical conversations on North-South intersectionality and how it applies to the Australian First Nations context. Aimee is working on regenerative drawdown energy projects with Mind the Sky as equity and diversity consultant with Kana Small Grants Committee. We also have time from Associate Professor Amanda Tattersall, thank you so much, who is with the Sydney Policy Lab at the University of Sydney, where she leads their co-design approach to policy and is the academic lead for Australia's largest economic and climate transition project, The Real Deal. Previously, she co-founded GetUp, founded the Sydney Alliance, was an elected official at Unions New South Wales, and hosts the Changemakers podcast. We also have Natalie Lowry. Thank you, Natalie, for your time as well. Natalie has been working as a grassroots activist and campaigner for over 2 decades with a strong focus on rights of local communities and Indigenous peoples, resisting development aggression on their lands and territories. She's a digital strategist with action skills, communications coordinator for Deep Sea Mining Campaign, and coordinator at Aid Watch Australia, where I've had the chance to interact with her. So I'm going to draw up a set of slides now. And last year before COP, I did an analysis of how international climate activists look at India's climate performance. And I did send it out to the Kana list. This year, I'm interested to, as a co-founder of Sapna, and at Sapna, we have kind of moved the conversation in a certain direction about what is North-South intersectionality in climate activism. Interested to actually open that up and have a discussion in a forum like this. So basically the focus of the presentation today, and I'm going to speak for 15 minutes or less, because it'll be really good to take questions at the end and also to hear from the panelists about how this applies in the Australian context. The focus really is on problematizing the singular coal versus renewables narrative that we have going at this point of time, and then considering what from the perspective of global climate justice, from the perspective of global South climate justice, can be narratives and can be frames through which we need to understand this really complex process of a transition and addressing the climate challenge. So essentially, what's going on at the moment is that India is being criticized for its slow net zero target of 2070. So this is just kind of at the surface level. At the surface level, India is being critiqued for its late target of 2070 for achieving net zero. India is also being highly commended for an ambitious renewable energy plan, of achieving 50% of its electricity from renewable sources, from clean energy sources by 2030, and for reducing its emission intensity, commitment to reduce its emission intensity by 45% by 2030. Now, the focus of this presentation is not to get into a technical analysis of the gaps between commitment and delivery. The focus is more on the model and the approach with which we look at India's climate performance, and also perhaps Australia's climate performance, and how it does or does not actually connect with grounded climate justice arguments brought by communities and groups who are on the front line of extractivism and climate change. So international climate activists kind of apply this kind of a pull and push frame to India. The pull being the, basically kind of celebrating India's ambitious renewables energy target, and the push kind of being pushing India on its slow net zero target, and so on and so forth. Now, what is interesting and what problematizes this is that we all know of Adani. So Adani is the largest renewables developer in India, largest solar developer, and it's also kind of becoming the largest solar developer in the world with the kind of scale of project that Adani is building. So if we know Adani to be problematic from Adani's Carmichael mine in Australia and Adani's knowing of Adani's practices, could we really apply that very singular frame of coal versus renewables when we understand the way India's renewables development is going? That's one point, but let's get a bit deeper into this in a minute. What I would love to do actually now is bring in this context of complexity and how we need to have complexity in our understanding of the ground in a place like India, where not one frame or not one solution applies, especially when we're talking about transitioning, addressing the climate challenge, and transitioning from coal to renewables. So to pull out a quote which we spoke about a lot in the workshops in August and September, and everyone took it to heart, is from Arundhati Roy, a much-loved writer: to never simplify what is complicated or to complicate what is simple. Let's hold that in our minds as we go through this presentation. In our workshops, I'm going to bring up a couple of slides from the workshops, because in our workshops, we talked about intersectionality specifically as it applies. As a practitioner, I would say, as I see it applying to being able to kind of to bring solidarity between the global North and South in climate activism. Intersectionally obviously comes from the Black feminist movement, from the feminist movement, and it is essentially about being able to draw down on and build bridges across differences in race, class, caste, gender, understand as it applies within the climate space, understanding climate change as an old issue through a new lens for the majority of the world and the majority of the world's movements and struggles, not as a new issue. And obviously also a critique of market neoliberalism and capitalism. So basically, the North-South intersectionality proposition, why it really matters for climate activism, is because the way Western activists shape narratives have a lot of impact on the global South. Not only do they have an impact on campaigns in the global South, which are funded internationally, which are funded from the global North. Global South governments' arms are also strengthened by the kind of frames and narratives that activists, influential NGOs from the global North build. So there's, in fact, a sense of responsibility that should be there in terms of the kinds of narratives that come from the global North. So again, stories around what constitute global climate activism and global climate action are largely framed and shared from mainstream climate activist groups in the global North. And whereas the majority of the struggles over land, over extractive projects, over coal, and now even over renewables is happening in the global South. So basically, how do we incorporate narratives and stories from the ground up into a global narrative, which will have to include essentially critique Western NGOs uncritically support. And the last proposition, which we discussed in the workshops, which is relevant to today, is that while the world needs a rapid transition away from fossil fuels, which is just one half of the story, the other half is about creating just futures. There's a difference between climate action and climate justice, which we need to remember. There is a long quote from Professor Kyle Weitz, who is an indigenous academic, scholar, and activist in the United States, which I will leave right now, and we can come back to because the PowerPoint will be circulated. It's basically in response to a quote and a comment by Extinction Rebellion UK in terms of not having time to do it right and not having time for social justice in the need to transition from coal to renewables. So this is at the heart of what I'm going to talk about today. So the next 5 minutes, I'm basically going to kind of just talk through the two stories of climate justice that emerge from India. One is a story that we're fairly familiar with. That is the story about what the Indian government says. And the Indian government has been saying that for a long time. And part of it is rightfully so. So as a post-colonial global South country, sovereign in its right to develop, India basically stakes its place on the world stage and talks about the need to develop and for the West to do more and to take action first. So this narrative has been going on for a very long time. This was first talked about at the Stockholm Convention in the 1970s by Indira Gandhi, India's only female prime minister, and she was an environmentalist prime minister, about are we too poor to be clean? Are we too poor to be afford to be clean in terms of India? So that narrative has continued, that position in international diplomacy has continued. And in the climate era, it has been about equity and the need to develop, well, those responsible for climate change take action. But what does it also mean for India as it increases coal usage, as its emissions increase, India came under more critique for that narrative. What do activists and researchers like myself think of this narrative? I think we don't have enough time to talk about it. We cannot completely disagree with this narrative about the West needing to do more and take action first. However, we do not uncritically support this narrative in the present times. So we can have a discussion about this in the discussion section, and I'm happy to stay on for more discussions. But just to put it out there, this is not something that we can completely dismiss as Indian activists, scholars, and researchers, given the history of colonization, but also given the multiple challenges that exist today. One of them actually in being able to have access to technology and finance for climate solutions and for energy transition. But the next narrative is what we work with mostly. The narrative and the stories of land-based struggles against extraction, not just of coal, all kinds of minerals, extraction and extractive projects on people's lands, and large-scale energy projects, which include coal and thermal power plants, and equally now large-scale renewable projects, which are dotting the Indian landscape. So in the Indian context, and in my PhD thesis, which I finished last year, I compare anti-coal activisms in India and Australia. I do an embedded immersive ethnography of the struggles against the Carmichael coal mine and also a coal mine in India, in central India. And basically what I write about is the fact that the narratives of anti-coal struggles in India are not very different from other struggles against extraction. Those are not essentially struggles to stop coal with the higher objective of stopping climate change. Those are grounded struggles of indigenous communities as well as non-indigenous peasant communities living on the land and wanting to defend their land. So what kind of narratives come from those kinds of struggles? What are the futures that those communities need? Are India's large-scale renewables, large-scale solar parks, massive solar parks, which have most of the funding, as opposed to small-scale microgrids, rooftop solar, and other ways of putting solar and renewables on the landscape, which is actually beneficial for communities. Most of the investment from the international market, neoliberal market, goes to large-scale solar. So what kind of futures do these communities need? And how does renewable energy come into it? Those are the kinds of questions that we're involved with. That's the climate justice story that requires critical understanding from Western activists, from Australian climate activists, and it has nothing to do with the coal versus renewables frame.
I'll just let you know that it's 18 past.
Okay. So I've got 2 more minutes. So basically, Sapna created some infographics and they're on our website. I'll put a link to the website in terms of from the perspective of these communities and these struggles. What are false climate solutions versus what are just climate solutions? People-centric, based on the principles of secure rights, and essentially, basically, how do we still talk about moving from coal to renewables while keeping all these grounded struggles and their needs and their futures and aspirations in mind? It would have to include all these principles. So basically, to kind of finish, I'm going to, and this is where the respondents come in. We're going to talk about how do we then bring this to Australia, where actually in the climate movement, we have no critique of net zero, no critique of neoliberal markets. We in fact ride on them. And also the vision of Australia as a big sunny continent, ripe for massive solar parks and a fascination for large-scale projects. So basically the question then is that how can we build critical solidarities with these kinds of struggles, which are occurring in the majority of the world? A lot of them are occurring in India. They're occurring in the majority of the world, with the kind of climate narrative and approach that we have from Australia. And also how do these narratives and stories from the global south actually intersect with an Australian reality that we're perhaps not including in our narratives? So here are some links and resources. The people's demand for climate action is basically the demands of global climate justice activists, and they're worth looking at. My thesis is on academia, and basically the article I wrote last year, none of the principles in that change in terms of how to interpret India's climate actions is on Green Left Weekly, and I can put all these links in the chat. So this is the end of my presentation. And I'm going to now pass on first to Aimee for her response. So Aimee, Amanda, and then Natalie, 5 minutes each for your responses, after which we'll go to questions.
Thank you so much, Ruchira, and thank you for the invitation to respond. It's been really, I suppose it fills my cup to have gone to the workshops back in September to hear some of the same issues that First Nations are struggling with here, and spending a lot of our energy fighting the fight to protect, rather than being able to put our creativity into the solutions into the future, which may actually look quite different to what a lot of environmental groups may have envisioned, with a very narrow view from only perhaps one school of thought or cultural perspective. So thank you for all your work on and Sapna's work. I know some good friends from Sapna are on here today. I just also want to acknowledge the country I'm on and the custodians of the Wanneroo people, and also my elders on Gomeroi country who I helped to fight fossil fuel projects such as Santos, Whitehaven, etc. And I suppose my response is the homogenisation of thought and also of solutions. I see it come across, even on those last two slides, saying large-scale renewable and large-scale dams and that sort of thing. Those two things are already threatening our country, and they're actually threatening the place where some of my several generations back ancestors lived. So Dungowan Dam, which was proposed a long time ago, and we've seen the dams overflowing copiously with all the rain and the flooding, the humongous flooding that Gomeroi country has just had. So looking at these solutions that have the potential to actually kill tens of thousands of people, even hundreds of thousands of people, and have done so. I'm actually heartened to see in your presentations, Ruchira, and with the efforts online with social media, to have these different perspectives come up, because the homogenisation of some of the arguments is something that I have voiced myself, but have not necessarily been listened to by certain groups that I work with. And I suppose what I see is that at the moment, there's an emotional process that we're going through, and at the moment, current solutions are looking at preserving our current ways, just swapping out the renewable energy and, swapping into renewable energy out of fossil fuels, and thinking that that is our sole solution, sort of doesn't allow us to step back and realise how we came to these positions and the colonisation of culture that led us to even choose coal in the first place, to even choose oil and gas in the first place. Why did we make those choices? Why did it sacrifice the values and cobweb of network of nature and in the food chain? Why did we make those decisions in the first place? So I suppose it also flows into today's some of what's happened. For instance, just to give an example before I finish, is yesterday I participated in a vote for 2 banks in Mahanta, and they've now been homogenised. There's the Greater Building Society, which is now the Greater Bank, and Newcastle Permanent Building Society. And the fact that those 2 community-owned banks, which are quite large, have now been homogenised into one entity says to me that the community and the banks itself do not recognise the strengths of each organisation. They do not recognise the assets that they hold, the differences of opinion they hold, or the customers that they hold. And that's a really financialised version, but it again reflects the culture that we've got into such habits of living that we don't question, because it is the dominant culture and the dominant corporate culture that actually eliminates things continually, and questioning our processes and questioning whether the global south perspective and Indigenous perspectives are in there. If you tend to see anything homogenised or turned from 2 entities into one, please question it. And refer to Sapna's reports for those additional perspectives, and include Sapna and First Nations in your talks, because the diversity of opinions, the diversity of solutions, and the acceptance of moving to a lower power culture. In our cultures, we have these solutions, and some of those solutions have never been vetted, but due to dominant culture, our voices and our solutions are in the shadows. So thank you for raising this all and having such great discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aimee. We'll come back to some of these points in the during the discussion. To you, Amanda.
Cool, thank you so much. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land that was never ceded. So I want to talk just about climate justice. I want to lift up the word justice, and I want to emphasize that it can be a verb and not just a noun. I want to have sort of 2 points around that. So the first is that this idea of justice that's I really hear in what Ruchira was saying, and also what Aimee has been saying, is that justice speaks to how we relate. And we need to listen more and tell less. It's an orientation that needs to be in everything we do in climate and also in other movements, which is less selling people on the idea that climate is important and more finding out what's going on for other people and seeing how that experience might connect to what's going on with the climate. I feel like that, when Naomi Klein came to Australia in 2015, she spoke a lot about how climate changed everything. If that is true, then everything can be a climate issue. And rather than assuming and imposing a sort of, a northern frame on everything, then to turn it into a climate issue, listening for what the climate issues are in communities and not presuming that we know what they are is going to be really important. And so, like, lifting up what Aimee said just then about the idea of difference rather than homogeneity, and seeing that the difference is already there is really important. Added to that, when we listen, I think it's about respecting proximity. So climate looks different on different countries, right? On country, firstly, climate happens on country, and we need to recognise that this is an experience where we need to privilege First Nation voices in the process of responding to climate. And so we need to work at a pace that is going to allow us to actually do that work, but also recognise that the climate experience in places is going to be different. If you're talking climate in Lismore, it's different to talking climate in Gladstone. And the difference is that the subject matter is different, but the process is the same, listening. Right? More listening as part of how we relate and engage with climate. So the second piece I want to say in my 2 minutes to go is that we also have to land climate justice, that it's not just a sort of vague, sort of nice to have. It's actually how our politics need to be practiced. And when I say land, I mean it's both a where and a how. In that climate change is a lived experience here on the ground, in place, and we need to be, and the solutions to climate change also need to be landed as well. So I just want to, I completely agree with the discussion that's been here, which is that the shiny beads that come from mass billionaire renewable companies are the same shiny beads that got us into this trouble from last century, which is that technology is not going to save us in this moment. Technology needs to land in community and provide co-benefits to those communities, or the technology is going to be a problem. The issue is how renewable farms land in communities, or wind farms land in communities, not simply that the technology in and of itself has a saintly quality. And I feel like we've slipped into a space in Australia where we've lent into the idea that renewables are better than coal because they're not polluting, but that is not the only measure of a good technology. I mean, I'm glad that they don't pollute, but if they rip people off and if they don't solve the problems in a community, then they're equally going to be a problem. And for instance, in Gladstone, right, there's hydrogen labs in Gladstone. We're working in the Real Deal project in Gladstone. We've been there for a bit over a year, organising in the community. There's a lot of polls say that people care about climate change, right? That's lovely. But actually on the ground, people are deeply skeptical that the hydrogen labs are going to be just as shit as the LNG process that was there, where it's fly in, fly out labour, that there's no local economic development. And so there's a real debate in the community about whether this is going to mean anything but just more money for rich people rather than actually creating meaningful change for the communities in Gladstone. And I think that that is something that, as people who believe in justice, we need to think about. But you know what? There is a big issue in Gladstone. The hospital is crap. You can't have a baby in that hospital in Gladstone. And last week, another baby died in that hospital because of the conditions. There's a really, really easy conversation to be had that if you're going to build hydrogen labs in Gladstone, you need to fix the hospital in Gladstone. You need to create co-benefits for communities if you're going to come into those communities. But that creates nuance and relationships and conversations and slowness to our fastness that I think that's often in the climate movement we struggle with. But I think that if we are true to relating and to being serious about what it takes to land our climate politics in different parts of the country, that will speak more closely to the politics that Ruchira is talking about.
Thank you, Amanda. There's so much in it. Again, we'll revisit some of this during the discussion. To you, Natalie.
Thanks, Ruchira, and thanks to Aimee and Amanda too. You've brought up some really crucial points here. I'm on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people in Kulin Nation and Naarm, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Just to give you some context, I've been working around climate issues since the early 2000s. I can see James Whelan on the call here. He can vouch for that one. And that's included, taking direct action, coal infrastructure. And in 2000, I was also working with Wiradjuri in central western New South Wales against a massive mine with the largest mining company in the world. And I went to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues in 2007 with a couple of Wiradjuri elders. And I was really woken up, although justice and solidarity have always been central in my work, I really woke up to the reality of this framing of, fossil fuels versus renewables at all costs, because in that forum, where you're not allowed to protest, the entire Latin American bloc, which was mainly made up of women and mothers, protested because their interventions around the land grabbing from renewables wasn't actually placed in the final kind of statement. So that's when I started to realize, oh, well, this is just not always the answer either. And that sort of led me into some other areas of work, which is in the same sort of frame, I guess. And part of it for me, so there's justice, but there's also solidarity. And just to reiterate, Amanda, these are verbs, you've got to actually action these. And I feel, and this is my kind of critique of the climate movement here, is it is very narrow and inward, and solidarity is a word, but when you're talking about solidarity with the global south, I see very little, and I really hate to say that, but that's just the reality of my experience. I've been working with communities in Malaysia since 2011 who have been resisting against Lynas Rare Earth, which is an Australian company, against their rare earth processing plant. This is a radioactive toxic legacy that's been left there. And there's no real reaction from Australia or the climate movement, despite us bringing Malaysians here for like 5 years. And that's just one example. So solidarity is really crucial. That means us stepping back and putting the voices of those people who are really on the front lines, whether it's front lines in the Pacific from rising sea levels, or whether it's the front lines of the actual supply chains of the opening up of critical minerals for the so-called green transition. So the opening up for these critical minerals is massive. I work on this day to day, and it's kind of mind-blowing at how huge it's going to be and how destructive it's going to be, all in the name of, you know, a green transition, renewables, electric vehicles, you name it. And under AidWatch, under our Alternatives to Green Extractivism kind of campaign, we've spent the last year researching Australia's footprint, both domestically and internationally, around critical minerals, but specifically lithium, copper, nickel, rare earth, and cobalt. And it's kind of very intense. And I almost don't know where to start with the climate movement to have this conversation, because I'll be frank with you, some of the responses I've had over the years is that's not my fight. And it is actually, if we think that we're going to solve all this under the guise of green capitalism, which is what this is, we are not going to. We're going to create the same set of problems. If we're going to believe the likes of BHP and Rio Tinto that they're now green, and the greenwashing that's happening, and just this is beyond just coal and gas, this is into the critical minerals sort of space as well, then we're in real danger. And it is the voices of the global south that are leading this, because they are the ones who are impacted by this day to day. And I'm going to leave you with one last campaign I work on, which I've been working on for a decade now, around the issue of deep sea mining. In the next year, it's a massive year for us. There is a global movement, but it's a massive year where basically deep sea mining could open up. And if it opens up in the Pacific Ocean, we're talking about an area the size of the lower half of the United States. It will be the biggest mining operation the world has ever seen. And it is Pacific communities, Indigenous communities, that are leading the way against this. It was Fiji that has come out first calling for a moratorium. It's followed by Samoa and Palau. Yet Western countries are still lagging behind. Australia is nowhere to be seen in this conversation. And I think a lot of people think, well, the Pacific Ocean is out of sight, out of mind. It's in the deep sea. But to bring in interconnectedness, intersectionality, we have to approach what we're doing this way. And I think, Amanda, I really like what you said, that every issue is a climate issue, because that is also, you know, as like, oh, well, you work on that mineral, that's got nothing to do with climate. It's like, it's all interlinked. Food sovereignty is interlinked. Like, I could go on and on. So I really want to thank you, Ruchira, for bringing this conversation forward. I'm very excited to see how we can push forward. I don't have the answers on how we can shift all this narrative. Like, it's quite an important discussion and probably a debate among us all as well. But I'm just really grateful that this is in the climate space now here in Australia. And I want to leave, actually, I'm going to leave on a quote from Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, who now heads up the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. So currently in Sydney is the International Mining and Resource Conference, IMARC. And yeah, she opened it, which is kind of amazing, but she opened it with a speech in which she said 50% of the 700 critical mineral projects currently overlap 50% of the 700 critical mineral projects overlap conservation areas or sacrifice zones. This is what's happening now. And 80% of these are on Indigenous peoples or peasants peoples' lands. So, you know, that was a clear message within a mining industry conference. So I'm not sure how they would take it, because that whole conference is about greenwashing, not just coal, but the whole extractive paradigm. So we do need to move past this extractive paradigm that we're in, and we need to question this. Is the system we're in is not going to be the way we're going to solve these issues. So I just want to thank you again.
And I want to thank all of you, three of you, Aimee, Amanda, and Natalie, for your responses. there's again just a lot packed into what you said, and a lot packed into the topic that we have raised. I'm going to pass on now for questions and comments with just a couple of observations and a couple of thoughts in terms of how to take all this. There's a lot of energy that was generated in the workshops in August and September, a lot of energy generated in the Sapna report launch last week. And similarly, I feel again, a lot of energy generated. How do we move forward, perhaps in very small steps? And these kinds of conversations also perhaps happen in other forums within the climate space in Australia. So here are a couple of really humble suggestions. This is the first one is actually, so the four things that came up extremely strongly are basically kind of, basically summarize what three of you spoke about. The first one is on non-homogenization of narratives, non-homogenization of stories, fundamentally critical, not to kind of overpower and drown stories. Homogenization is what we should try and avoid. The second one is on listening, needing to listen, and these two go hand in hand, and the need for nuanced narrative and the need for critical solidarity in the Australian context, very strongly of what Natalie ended with, of critical minerals and the mining boom of critical minerals that, probably we're already getting into. So I think the couple of suggestions I've got, and this is something that came out of the workshops, there was a suggestion for actually having a messaging forum when we can start looking at some of these unquestioned narratives of Australia as a renewable energy superpower, with all the implications of what a superpower is, and various other implications that come with those kinds of narratives, which is uncritically kind of passed around and supported in the climate movement. And I think Adam Black from Sunrise had a suggestion of how we could possibly do this in the Move Beyond Coal Slack channel. Adam, if you want to just kind of put something in chat about it as a suggestion to anyone who's interested to join, that'd be great. And Aimee kind of initially did kind of suggest that why would we have a messaging forum? Thank you, Aimee, for that. So that's one perhaps tiny step where people who are interested to kind of start workshopping and thinking about problematic narratives, we can try that. The other thing is to actually have a movement-wide workshop. I love workshops, and I think a lot of us really enjoyed workshops, but to actually have a movement-wide workshop on some of these things that we have raised, and we can't resolve obviously in just 1 hour. Maybe that's something we could work towards. And perhaps the two fundamental things that come together in the workshop in terms of solidarity and intersectionality is trying to understand what renewables is doing to the ground in India, what I talked about in a presentation, and is to actually include the problem of renewables starting another mining boom for critical minerals, which is going to be the reality on Indigenous lands in Australia. Perhaps those two things front and center, and we start to address the need for solidarity and the need for actually making the narrative more complex and moving away from a singular frame, which is something that I'm fundamentally passionate about and have always been interested in. So having said that, I'm going to pass on for people to ask questions and come up with comments. We've got 20 minutes, and let's get started. And thank you again to the respondents, Aimee, Amanda, and Natalie.
I guess the problem with the sort of responsible investing is this whole kind of environmental social governance, ESG, which most of you would have heard of. And it's really problematic because it's just another kind of greenwashing. And we're seeing that all over the place. We sort of dissected a bit of that in the research we're doing, because it's just another avenue to go, oh, this project's fine because we're ESG compliant. And an example is one of the main companies pushing deep sea mining, and I should have said that with deep sea mining, the narrative that the PR spin that the industry is putting out there is that they're saviors for the climate change because these are the minerals for the green transition. So we're going to go dig up our deep sea beds. I mean, I don't think you have to be much of a scientist, marine biologist to understand this is pretty insane. But they use ESG in all their kind of PR as well. So Yeah, I don't really have an answer around that. I'm a little doubtful about it. That's probably my issue around the sort of responsible investment. But in saying that, a key part of our work with deep sea mining is actually finance advocacy. So we talk to banks and we talk to insurers, and we have now 9 banks, including the European Investment Bank, who have now put in their policies to not invest in deep sea mining. So that's one avenue, but that's just one aspect of this transition issue, I guess. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's sort of my take on the sort of responsible investment.
I'll just throw one thought in. I actually think one of the biggest challenges in this space is a question of scale. So ESG or responsible investment, they're all about one's homogenous rule that comes from the centre that's imposed out. And what is being argued here is actually local matters, difference matters, decentralisation matters, country matters, that actually differentiation, different strategies, different approaches are key. And it's almost like there's a scale clash between some of these boxy concepts that want to just wrap up, oh, you can be good if you tick these boxes. The reason why the boxes are annoying, right? It's not just because it's simplistic. It's also that it's just the scale doesn't work. We're not Coca-Cola, right? Just because the Earth, our planet, and our people are not a marketing game. And so I feel like there needs to be just here. I feel like if I was thinking about the intervention that could be done on this space, there's a few conceptual interventions that Ruchira is raising. Like one is the skill and capacity to listen and then have listening apply to campaigns, right? Rather than them being centrally organised, that there is a space and role for listening in the creation of campaigns. But another one is to disrupt how we understand scale. And I'll put a thing in the chat about an article I've just written about this idea of scale. But I think that we keep thinking we need to go big, so climate is in trouble, and it's in trouble everywhere. And the challenge, that the lesson that we're learning from the Global South is that's not where the most successful extractivist campaigns are being fought and won. They are being fought locally with communities. That's what's successful. And so the challenge for us to translate those lessons is to think about, well, goodness gracious, maybe our presumptions about scale are not serving us.
And I'll respond as well, if that's okay. I suppose tacking on to what both Nat and Amanda have said, ESG, I agree, is not a standard to judge things by. And to flow on from what Amanda has said, cooperatives and sort of community organisations are often where globally our communities developed from. So everyone pooled their resources. They were in a food cooperative, or they were in a housing cooperative, or these sort of things. And I know at the moment, our idea of wealth, of being able to invest our wealth and have some sort of what seems like a lump sum and a dividend from that, or a simple return. If we think of wealth differently, and if we think about the reality that our communities are all going to be isolated by weather again, and have been, like even this year, Maitland has been cut off and we've had to stay in at home, and many of you may have experienced this, is wealth is actually when the community will function despite that happening to a certain extent. So having some of those business models, again, those community business models, there are some companies who are starting to educate people in renewing the structures. So I suppose I see that the current structures, even if they're judged by the ESG, as Nat has pointed out, that we're still using those principles under the same system. And that's the system that still marginalises people. Whereas if we go back to some of the community models, which could even be improved by the experience we've just gone through, then we create a resilient community. We create wealth distribution and the ability for everyone to respond in a climate change disaster situation in a much more robust manner. So I suppose thinking of wealth differently and restructuring our organisations to be more community-based, which is something I suppose that Amanda was talking about scale. We think about scale differently.
Thank you. I think I just kind of get some structures for, kind of a future potential workshop, because what you ended with, Aimee, I mean, this whole thing of, instead of looking at a company and what are their policies, the idea is to look at a community and look at community futures and start from there and come back. And we are also caught up in all of us, campaigners, activists, it's not our community, but we're so caught up in kind of critiquing something that we missed that point. That's crucial. And the question of scale, really, and scale is what actually connects what I talked about from India and kind of the issues that we're talking about from here. So I think I kind of see some structures emerging for a potential movement-wide workshop if people are interested, kind of around some of these themes which actually kind of resonate across the global north and south. Just wanted to pass that on. I'm happy for Amanda, Aimee, your responses on this, because this,
I've been putting resources in the chat. There's a guy who's based in Newfoundland and Canada called Paris Marx. Some of you may have heard of him, and he looks at pretty much like the transport kind of part of this. But he has a really good podcast called Tech Won't Save Us, which is really worth a listen, and it really goes into some of this sort of argument. So just to reiterate again, the EV kind of thing is a really big thing around deep sea mining as well. And I think the question is, do we really need any more cars? Should we be investing in better transport systems, sometimes I go back to my dad, actually, who would just go, well, we can't do that. And I'm like, well, if we can dig big holes in the ground and we can build these skyscrapers, honestly, we can change these systems. And, I just want to go back to Aimee, like, there are so many alternatives, and I don't like the word alternatives necessarily, because for Indigenous peoples, there's some traditional practices also that have been around a long time. And I think a lot of the answers lie there. And it is about, I think it's really hard because sometimes in my campaign, I'm like, it's stop this, stop that. And I really want to shift it to like, actually, there is all these amazing things going on. How do we shift that conversation and tell those stories to sort of balance it out? Because it can be a real space of despair. We know that. And I think that's about trying to put those voices up front, from the global north kind of concepts around what we can do, but also very much from the south, what is already happening in the south, and also new ideas that may be Indigenous led, bringing in a bit of this sort of Western modernity to kind of see where we can go. I have no doubt that we can. I think it's going to be really difficult. I don't think it's going to be an easy path. I think there's no easy way out of this. And actually, I saw a quote this morning and was quite impressed. And you may have already seen it from Julia Steinberg, who's one of the lead IPCC authors. And she says, if we make it, which is doubtful, we make it because we unmade ourselves as consumers and remade ourselves as humans, freeing to decide our own relationship with the world around us, refusing extraction, domination, and exploitation. Now, I'm really impressed to see that from an author with the IPCC. And I think it's something I really take to heart. I know in the climate movement, when I say the words like degrowth, people cringe. And I think we need to relook at maybe it's language, but we need to, in the West, really rethink what that means. And it is about our consumption levels. We can't just make more cars and consume more energy. And, this whole kind of growth narrative is not helping us at all. And it's taking us further and further away from actually really trying to get through these multiple crises that we're in.
I'll tag team onto that if I can. There are just different ways, and I suppose taking what Nat just said about there are solutions that Indigenous mob have of the way we use resources. And it's actually, for instance, what I'm working on, which I haven't really mentioned that much because it's still, I suppose, in a stage of development, is helping people understand carbon. We talk about carbon, we talk about more about CO2 than we do about carbon. And I suppose I've even seen, I suppose I spend a lot of time looking at fire and charcoal, because charcoal is my business, Mind the Sky. is about the way we include biomass in the way we think of renewable energy and localized energy. And probably a lot of you are sitting there going, fire, hang on, isn't fire what got us into this mess? And actually what I do is I help people to understand the way carbon can change its form, what can be burnt, its proximity to where it was grown and where it is taken to be burnt. All of that has an impact on the environment. And I suppose I see lots of things being developed as solutions for climate, but they're developed in isolation. And my other half has a real problem with this because he's an electrical engineer. And I say, well, engineers are great at looking at the science and coming up with a solution. But unfortunately, that science solution works in isolation, but it doesn't work in the environment, the Earth, our Earth Mother's system. And when you scale it up, it works even worse, scaling it up when it doesn't work in that system. So helping people to understand carbon, and instead of moving away from the understanding of it, which we keep doing further and further and further, is actually just using it differently, burning it differently, and taking responsibility individually could start to mitigate. So actually, unbelievably, with everything that's going on, even the vigil yesterday and what's happening to mob, I still have hope that if we change the way we use things, if we listen to mob and we understand the resources that we talk so much about, instead of flying past them and trying to communicate them without actually understanding how they work. You need to science this, you folks. We've got to science it, we've got to make science sexy again, because if we actually understand that we're putting a piece of green waste into the bin and it's going to decompose and go up into the atmosphere, but if we do something slightly different with it in a different system, we could be putting that down into the ground. And charcoal is in the same stable format as coal. So we could collectively be charcoal, or let's say pyrolyzing is the sexy science word for it, and putting that charcoal or that carbon preserved down into the ground. And that's enough self-promotion. I'll just mute myself.
Thanks so much for that, Aimee. I think that it's something we could do at the beginning, at the end of every session, really, is to kind of just go right back and thank you for that. We are at the end of our 1 hour. I'm just wondering if Amanda has a quick response, and then we'll just end.
No, my only response is that I think degrowth is not a frame that's going to win the world over, but I do think there are ways to express it differently. And my favorite at the moment is less is more. Like, actually, we know that a simpler, richer life, and I feel like we need to reframe this. Instead of degrowth, it needs to be an embrace of our humanity that's been lost.
With that, I thank Aimee, Amanda, Natalie for your time to kind of have this discussion with me. And I thank everyone. Thank you, Brooke, for coordinating this. Thanks everyone for coming. If anyone has questions that you couldn't ask and we ran out of time, feel free to actually just write to us at Sapna, or write to me at my email address, which was sent around. And we'll send around the chat as well, because there were lots of links in that. And I would be really interested, and I think so would the panelists, the others, to actually continue the momentum here. Sapna would be as well. So let's actually think of maybe a workshop in the future where we bring a lot of these things together and kind of drill right down to the depths of actually thinking about solidarity and narrative in a systematic way, and thinking about communities and futures and resilience first before we come to narratives. Thanks everyone for coming.